rocking and rolling on that. Today we're talking about chapter 31 and chapter 42. I tied that in with it. 31 is on addiction and substance-related disorders. That's really our main topic today, period. The last hour, we're going to have a guest speaker come and talk to you about the nurse recovery program and, some of the problems with substance use and abuse with professionals and such. Okay, so with this topic, that is the perfect time for us to discuss that. Now, I hope let me share my screen. Everybody with your chapter 31 here outline brought your questions for addiction video. So you can kind of have that in front of you, because we're going to start off by watching two little clips, okay? And this is the same individual that you heard talk to speak on depression earlier.
One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I was just a little kid, so I didn't really understand why. But as I got older, I realized we had drug addiction in my family, including later cocaine addiction. I've been thinking about it a lot lately, partly because it's now exactly 100 years since drugs were first banned in the United States and Britain, and we then imposed that on the rest of the world. It's a century since we made this really fateful decision to take addicts and punish them and make them suffer because we believed that would deter them, it would give them an incentive to stop. And a few years ago, I was looking at some of the addicts in my life who I love and trying to figure out if there was some way to help them. And I realized there were loads of incredibly basic questions I just didn't know the answer to. Like, what really causes addiction? Why do we carry on with this approach that doesn't seem to be working? And is there a better way out there that we could try instead? So I read loads of stuff about it, and I couldn't really find the answers I was looking for. So I thought, okay, I'll go and sit with different people around the world who've lived this and studied this and talk to them and see if I can learn from them. And I didn't realize I would end up going over 30,000 miles at the start, but I ended up going and meeting loads of different people, from a transgender crack dealer in Brownsville, Brooklyn, to a scientist who spends a lot of time feeding hallucinogens to mongooses to see if they like them. It turns out they do, but only in very specific circumstances. To the only country that's ever decriminalized all drugs, from cannabis to crack, Portugal. And the thing I realized that really blew my mind is almost everything we think we know about addiction is wrong. And if we start to absorb the new evidence about addiction, I think we're going to have to change a lot more than our drug policies. But let's start with what we think we know, what I thought I know, right? Let's think about this middle row here, right? Imagine all of you for 20 days now went off and used heroin 3 times a day. Some of you look a little bit more enthusiastic than others at this prospect. Don't worry, it's just a thought experiment. Imagine you did that, right? What would happen? Now, we have a story about what would happen that we've been told for a century. We think because there are chemical hooks in heroin, as you took it for a while, your body would become dependent on those hooks, you'd start to physically need them, and at the end of those 20 days, you'd all be heroin addicts, right? That's what I thought. First thing that alerted me to the fact something not right with this story is when it was explained to me, if I step out of this TED Talk today and I get hit by a car and I break my hip, I'll be taken to hospital and I'll be given loads of diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin. It's actually much better heroin than you're ever going to buy on the streets, because the stuff you buy from a drug dealer is contaminated. Actually, very little of it is heroin, whereas the stuff you get from the doctor is medically pure. And you'll be given it for quite a long period of time. There are loads of people in this room who may not realize that you've taken quite a lot of heroin, right? And anyone watching this anywhere in the world, this is happening. And if what we believe about addiction is right, those people are exposed to all those chemical hooks. What should happen? They should become addicts. This has been studied really carefully. It doesn't happen. You will have noticed if your grandmother had a hip replacement, she didn't come out as a junkie. And when I learned this, It just seemed so weird to me, so contrary to everything I'd been told, everything I thought I knew. I just thought it couldn't be right. Until I went and met a man called Bruce Alexander, who's a professor of psychology in Vancouver, who carried out an incredible experiment that I think really helps us to understand this issue. Professor Alexander explained to me, the idea of addiction we've all got in our heads, that story, comes partly from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. You can do them tonight when you go home if you feel a little bit sadistic. You get a rat and you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself quite quickly. So there you go, right? That's how we think it works. In the 70s, Professor Alexander comes along and he looks at this experiment and he noticed something. He said, we're putting the rat in an empty cage. It's got nothing to do except use these drugs. Let's try something a bit different. So Professor Alexander built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically heaven for rats, right? They've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of colored balls, they've got loads of tunnels. Crucially, they've got loads of friends, they can have loads of sex, and they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. But here's the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They almost never use it. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. You go from almost 100% overdose when they're isolated to 0% overdose when they have happy and connected lives. Now, when he first saw this, Professor Alexander thought, maybe this is just a thing about rats. They're quite different to us, maybe not as different as we'd like, but, But fortunately, there was a human experiment into the exact same principle happening at the exact same time. It was called the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, 20% of all American troops were using loads of heroin. And if you look at the news reports from the time, they were really worried because they thought, my God, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of junkies on the streets of the United States when the war ends. It made total sense. Now, those soldiers who were using loads of heroin were followed home. The Archives of General Psychiatry did a really detailed study, and what happened to them? It turns out they didn't go to rehab. They didn't go into withdrawal. 95% of them just stopped. Now, if you believe the story about chemical hooks, that makes absolutely no sense. But Professor Alexander began to think there might be a different story about addiction. He said, what if addiction isn't about your chemical hooks? What if addiction is about your cage? What if addiction is an adaptation to your environment? Looking at this, there was another professor called Peter Cohen in the Netherlands who said, maybe we shouldn't even call it addiction. Maybe we should call it bonding. Human beings have a natural and innate need to bond. And when we're happy and healthy, we'll bond and connect with each other. But if you can't do that because you're traumatized or isolated or beaten down by life, you will bond with something that will give you some sense of relief. Now, that might be gambling, that might be pornography, that might be cocaine, that might be cannabis, but you will bond and connect with something because that's our nature. That's what we want as human beings. And I think, at first I found this quite a difficult thing to get my head around, but one way that helped me to think about it is, and I can see, I've got over by my seat there a bottle of water, right? I'm looking at lots of you, and lots of you have bottles of water with you, right? Forget drugs, forget the drug war. Totally legally, all of those bottles of water could be bottles of vodka, right? We could all be getting drunk, I might after this. But we're not, right? Now, because you've been able to afford the approximately a gazillion pounds that it costs to get into a TED Talk, I'm guessing you guys could afford to be drinking vodka for the next 6 months. You wouldn't end up homeless. You're not going to do that. And the reason you're not going to do that is not because anyone's stopping you. It's because you've got bonds and connections that you want to be present for. You've got work you love. You've got people you love. You've got healthy relationships. And a core part of addiction, I came to think, and I believe the evidence suggests, is about not being able to bear to be present in your life. Now, this has really significant implications. The most obvious implications are for the war on drugs, right? In Arizona, I went out with a group of women who were made to wear T-shirts saying I was a drug addict and go out on chain gangs and dig graves while members of the public could jeer at them. And when those women get out of prison, they're going to have criminal records that mean they'll never work in the legal economy again. Now, that's a very extreme example, obviously, in the case of the chain gang, but actually almost everywhere in the world we treat addicts to some degree like that. We punish them, we shame them, we give them criminal records, we put barriers between them reconnecting. There was a doctor in Canada, Dr. Gabor Mate, an amazing man, who said to me, if you wanted to design a system that would make addiction worse, you would design that system. Now, there's a place that decided to do the exact opposite, and I went there to see how it worked. In the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is kind of mind-blowing. And every year, they tried the American way more and more. They punished people and stigmatized them and shamed them more. And every year, the problem got worse. And one day, the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and basically said, look, we can't go on with a country where we're having ever more people becoming heroin addicts. Let's set up a panel of scientists and doctors to figure out what would genuinely solve the problem. And they set up a panel led by an amazing man called Dr. João Goulão to look at all this new evidence. And they came back and they said, decriminalize all drugs, from cannabis to crack. But, and this is the crucial next step, take all the money we used to spend on cutting addicts off, on disconnecting them, and spend it instead on reconnecting them with the society. And that's not, essentially, that's not really what we think of. What they did wasn't really what we think of as drug treatment in the United States and Britain. So they do residential rehab, they do psychological therapy that does have some value. But the biggest thing they did was the complete opposite of what we do. A massive program of job creation for addicts and microloans for addicts to set up small businesses. So say you used to be a mechanic. When you're ready, they go to a garage and they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. The goal was to make sure that every addict in Portugal had something to get out of bed for in the morning. And when I went and met the addicts in Portugal, it was fascinating. What they said is, as they rediscovered purpose, they rediscovered bonds and relationships with the wider society. It'll be 15 years this year since that experiment began, and the results are in. Injecting drug use is down in Portugal, according to the British Journal of Criminology, by 50%, 50%. Overdose is massively down. HIV is massively down among addicts. Addiction in every study is significantly down. One of the ways you know it's worked so well is that almost nobody in Portugal wants to go back to the old system. Now, that's the kind of political implications. I actually think there's a layer of implications to all this research below that. You know, we live in a culture where people feel really increasingly vulnerable to all sorts of addictions, whether it's to their smartphones or to shopping or to eating. You know, before these talks began, you guys know this, that we were told we weren't allowed to have our smartphones on. And I have to say, a lot of you looked an awful lot like addicts who were being told their dealer was going to be unavailable for the next couple of hours. And, you know, a lot of us feel like that. And it might sound weird to say, oh, you know, I've been talking about how disconnection is a major driver of addiction. But weird to say it's growing because you think, well, we're the most connected society there's ever been, surely. But I increasingly began to think that the connection we have, the connections we have, we think we have, are like a kind of parody of human connection. If you have a crisis in your life, you'll notice something. It won't be your Twitter followers who come to sit with you. It won't be your Facebook friends who help you turn it round. It'll be your flesh and blood friends who you have deep and nuanced and textured face-to-face relationships with. And I think there's a study I learned about from Bill McKibben, the environmental writer, I think tells us a lot about this. It looked at the number of close friends the average American believes they can call on in a crisis. That number has been declining steadily since the 1950s. The amount of floor space an individual has in their home has been steadily increasing. And I think that's like a metaphor for the choice we've made as a culture, right? We've traded floor space for friends, we've traded stuff for connections, and the result is that we are one of the loneliest societies there has ever been. And yet, Bruce Alexander, the guy who did the Rat Park experiment, says, we talk all the time in addiction about individual recovery, and it's right to talk about that, but we need to talk much more about social recovery. Something's gone wrong with us, not just as individuals, but as a group. And we've created a society where, for a lot of us, life looks a whole lot more like that isolated cage and a whole lot less like Rat Park. But if I'm honest, this isn't why I went into it, right? I didn't go in to discover the political stuff, the social stuff. I wanted to know how to help the people I love. And when I came back from this long journey and I'd learned all this, I looked at the addicts in my life, and if you're really candid, it's hard loving an addict, and there's going to be lots of people who know in this room you're angry a lot of the time. And I think one of the reasons why this debate is so charged is because it runs through the heart of each of us, right? Everyone has a bit of them that looks at an addict and thinks, I wish someone would just stop you. And the kind of script we're told for how to deal with the addicts in our life is typified by, I think, by the reality show Intervention. If you guys haven't seen it, I think everything in our lives is typified by reality TV, but that's another TED Talk. If you've never seen the show Intervention, it's a pretty simple premise. You get an addict, all the people in their life, gather them together, and say, if you don't shape up, they confront them with what they're doing, and they say, if you don't shape up, we're going to cut you off, right? So what they do is they take the connection to the addict and they threaten it. They make it contingent on the addict behaving the way they want. And I began to see why that approach doesn't work. And I began to think that almost that's like the importing of the logic of the drug war into our private lives. So I was thinking, well, how can I be Portuguese, right? And what I try to do now, and I can't tell you I do it consistently, and I can't tell you it's easy, is to say to the addicts in my life that I want to deepen the connection with them, to say to them, I love you, whether you're using or you're not. I love you, whatever state you're in. And if you need me, I'll come and sit with you because I love you and I don't want you to be alone or to feel alone. And I think the core of that message, you're not alone, we love you, has to be at every level of how we respond to addicts, socially, politically, and individually. For 100 years now, we've been singing war songs about addicts. I think all along we should have been singing love songs to them, because the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. Thank you.
Okay, so he brings out a lot of good points. I hope you had your sheet out and was filling in those questions. You know, what was his main delivery about addiction? Anybody?
It's not about like isolating them and telling them how wrong they are. It's about telling them how much you love them, how much you love them, and how much you want to be there for them.
Okay. But what about, you know, when I first watched this video and it talked about, he made it kind of seem like this was the new focus on addiction, whereas addiction as a disease and strictly as a disease, you can't look at it from that nutshell either, was the old one. Okay, and I always kind of thought was the flip-flop, you know, that the choice was always involved with that addict, that they could stop, choose to stop at any time. And later on, we discovered or got more information on supporting the fact that it is a disease, and these are the reasons that that addict can't stop, okay? So let's watch this second video.
Dr. A, where are the questions?
They were on their Moodle shell right under chapter 31 chapter, okay, that they could print off, and I asked them to print off and bring to class. Let me go down to that first and show y'all again. See right here, questions for addiction video. Okay, and it talks about the first video by the one we just watched. What is the theory about addiction? What does he say is the core of addiction? And what are your thoughts? And now we're going into our second one, which is the pathology of addiction. Okay, again, what is the theory here? Remember with chapter 8 with our neurotransmitters, we talked about dopamine and serotonin and how they play an important role. She's going to present that a little bit in more detail for you, okay? And again, with your thoughts. All right, so come out of here. We'll go back up here. Sorry about the commercial.
So what makes us who we are? Why, though each of us has one heart, 2 lungs, 1 nose, 2 legs, why are all so different from each other? Perhaps it's our chemistry. Perhaps on a scale the human eyes can't see, little molecules exist in various amounts, and these molecules in various amounts are what makes each individual just that, an individual. Many factors make us who we are. Everyone is familiar with the age-old argument of nature versus nurture. Our personalities, are they genetic or manufactured by our environment? It's both. Our genes begin the process by creating the foundation that everything else will build upon. Imagine tractors tilling the soil and preparing it for growth. Next, our personalities shape the land, like growing trees and building houses shape the land. So for the first decade of our lives, our brain is nurtured into a quaint little neighborhood, ready to house our thoughts and grow with the things we learn. But then puberty hits, and our hormones rage like a hurricane. Our brains naturally adapt, however, in some cases, maladapt. So what exactly do we mean by maladapt? Does nature take a wrong turn somewhere? It's not so much that nature goes wrong, but rather modifies things for our survival. One factor largely responsible for altering our minds and our bodies is stress. Stress can be very damaging. If stress lingers indefinitely, it is called chronic, inescapable stress. Chronic stress may come from abuse or low self-esteem. So when the body is stressed, it starts to produce certain substances that will help balance itself out. One of the key substances released is called glucocorticoids. They are released from the adrenal glands above the kidneys and directly affect the brain. Glucocorticoids seem to appear almost immediately in the presence of a stressor. They are interesting because they do not linger for long, however, are potent chemicals in shaping the brain landscape. Rather than using a tractor to prepare the land, it's more like using a jackhammer. How these glucocorticoids work in the addiction equation is this. It is believed that these glucocorticoids make the nucleus accumbens sensitive to dopamine. A nucleus accumbens that is sensitive to dopamine is more likely to release high levels of dopamine easily. Dopamine is a necessary substance for our survival, but like most things, must exist in moderation. So what is dopamine? Dopamine is a neurotransmitter found in the reward pathway of the brain that is directly connected to the pleasure centers. Dopamine is also responsible for driving the primitive survival mechanisms and is particularly important when it comes to motivation and feeling good. So dopamine translates our bodily needs into physical action. It makes us do things like run and hide if we're scared, skip and jump if we're happy, or make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich if we're hungry. Dopamine also causes us to be alert, like at night, if we hear a noise and are scared. This is one of the primal survival mechanisms that keeps us from being preyed upon. Now, low levels of dopamine can also cause us to be moody and irritable. But dopamine is replenished in the brain while we sleep, so when we wake, things always look brighter and more cheerful than they did the night before. That's why they say to sleep on it. So how does dopamine come into addiction? Because it is the ever-propagating motivator to have us want more and continue wanting more. Sounds addictive, doesn't it? And for someone who is an addict, they continue to want and want. Often the desire becomes so strong it can make them do some drastic things. Why is it, though, that an addict keeps wanting? Why is enough never enough? That's a good question, and brings us to another part of our addiction equation, serotonin. Serotonin's job is to put the brakes on dopamine. It controls the amount of information the brain processes at a given time. It basically tells us when enough is enough. It tells us that we are satiated. Without serotonin to tell us we've had enough to eat, to drink, or have spent enough money, the maladaptive brain would continue in its compulsive manner to quench the cravings. The brain is basically in overdrive and there are no brakes on the car. Serotonin sounds good where dopamine sounds bad. Such is not the case, however. Without dopamine to remind us that we're hungry, thirsty, or scared, humans would have never made it into existence. Dopamine's purpose is for survival, so craving can be good. The problem happens when our wires get crossed and our maladaptive brains get confused on what to crave. Here is a good example. Take Mr. Blue and Mr. Red. Red has a relatively normal brain terrain with the right levels of serotonin and dopamine. Blue, on the other hand, is an addict. He has a nucleus accumbens hypersensitive to dopamine and low baseline serotonin levels. The two crave an ice-cold beer after work. At this point, both are craving in exactly the same way. The difference we see is after each gets what they want. Blue, with low serotonin, never feels satiated. So even when he has beer after beer, there is not enough serotonin to tell him he has had enough. On the other hand, Red wanted one beer and one beer was enough. He had enough serotonin to make him feel satiated. The conclusion here, based on neurological and clinical research, is that a brain with a nucleus accumbens hypersensitive to dopamine plus low baseline serotonin levels equals addiction.
Okay. So what you learned with those two videos and everything, I want you to keep in mind, as we discuss what we're going to be getting into with chapter 31. Again, there you see that combination of biologic and environmental, factors that lead to this. But I do want you to understand for those individuals that are, have a true addiction problem, there is that underlying pathology, okay? And when that we fool around with our need to survive, and that's our driving force, we can see where they make decisions that we, an individual that is not addicted would just think is so crazy. And being able to understand that and see that can help you help these individuals a lot better. Okay, so I don't know why it keeps going out of there. We're going to start with chapter 31, and there is a small part in here where I incorporate the chapter on co-occurring disorders. That's just what I've said all semester. It's nothing new. That with somebody with mental illness, you need to look for a substance use problem, because it's more the rule than it is an exception. All right. There's objectives that I threw on this and sometimes when your chapters have objectives, it's on your slides. It's typically because they're a little bit different from what's in the book, just a smidgen. But so I didn't want to confuse you. And I included chapter 42 here. Okay, that's what we're going to focus on with that. We are experiencing epidemic proportions of drug use, drug abuse, and ultimately drug addiction, okay? Healthy People 2030 has that goal to reduce substance abuse, to protect the health, safety, and quality of life for all, especially children. This is a big problem, particularly among adolescents and young adults. Many mind-altering substances are physiologically addicting and can easily lead to severe health and legal problems. So let's go over some terms. Addiction. Addiction is the continued use of substances or reward-seeking behaviors despite adverse consequences. Okay? Another thing I want to add with this definition is that if they stop the drug, if they are addicted, they will have withdrawal symptoms. Now, use, that's the ingestion, smoking, sniffing, or injection of mind-altering substances. We all use from time to time. You know, I'm sure some of you sometimes go out and have an alcoholic drink with your BFF or whatever. Some of you may smoke to relax after a meal. It's not uncommon for use to occur. Abuse, on the other hand, is when you use that substance for purposes of intoxication or beyond its intended use. So notice that at the very beginning, okay, I said that we're going to talk about addiction and substance abuse problems, okay? It's necessary to catch these individuals that are abusing because they're going to get to that point where they're addicted, that if they stop the substance, they're going to experience withdrawal symptoms, right? And some of those withdrawal symptoms can be life-threatening depending on what substance we're talking about. Sometimes with abuse, if they used it like a weekend binge, they can have some mild little withdrawal symptoms if they're not totally addicted yet. So you're going to hear the term substance abuse, okay, and not just addiction quite a bit, because we're trying to get these individuals that are headed in the wrong direction. Of course, withdrawal, that's when symptoms occur when the substance is no longer used. Detoxification, I've talked about this in clinical orientation. That's the process for safe withdrawal. And then relapse just means a reoccurrence. So when you read your exam questions, make sure you may understand what it's asking, because there's a big difference between if the patient is detoxing or patient is in withdrawal versus if the patient's intoxicated, okay? So make sure you're looking at those terms correctly. So when we talk about a substance use disorder, it occurs when there is an underlying change in the brain circuitry that may persist after detoxification. And these changes can lead the person to experience cravings and make them relapse and ultimately, become full-blown addicted, like I said. We're talking about chemicals now, right? We're not really getting into the other type of addictions that are up and coming, like shopping or texting, whatever it might be. We're mainly talking about chemical addictions, chemical substance use disorders. Now, there is one exception, gambling. that we're going to spend just a little bit of time on, because gambling is recognized under this topic in your DMS-5. Okay? Because it activates the brain's reward system similar to how these other chemical substances activate the brain.